Hello, my name is Gary Pace. This is ASME Section 9 Overview Part 2. It's my version of a deep dive into ASME Section 9. This is Module 1F out of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission Introduction to Welding Technology and Code courses. I snagged a lot of these slides from them, chopped them up, thrown in my own stuff, pilfered some stuff out of military manuals, and this is what you get. Gary Pace's version of Section 9 and deep dive overview. 70% of my viewers seem to be in India, so hello to the guys in India. Hope everything's going well for you. I'm a professional engineer in a CWI out of Katy, Texas. I do some consulting occasionally and make these videos. Hopefully they're useful to the people out there watching them. Here's the acknowledgments. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Canadian CANDU, Canadian Deuterium Uranium Organization. I've taken a lot of other material out of U.S. military manuals. So I'm just telling you up front, I snagged most of this from other people and put my spin on it, and we'll go from there. Okay, Part QW Welding. There's 5 articles in Part QW Welding that we're going to look into. Article 1 is Welding General Requirements. That's what we're going to take care of in this YouTube video. Article 2 is Welding Procedure Qualifications. Article 3 is Welding Performance Qualifications. Article 4 is Welding Data. And Article 5 is Standard Welding Procedure Specifications. So for this episode, we're going to talk about QW welding. It might take me two little mini episodes to get through all the QW welding. But Article 1 for QW welding is the welding general requirements. That's what we're going to discuss in this one. But I'm also going to just basically touch on Article 2, 3, and 4 so we have some context on what QW Article 1 is versus Article 2 versus Article 3 versus Article 4. Okay, before we get into talking about welding and QW and ASME Section 9, we need to talk about the wall. I stole this. Well, I didn't really steal it. I borrowed it from Walt Spurko, who's the chairman of ASME Section 9. So if anybody wants to say that they saw Spurko speak and I stole this from him, yes, I did, but I stole it with his permission. So it's a fantastic idea. He said run with it, so I'm running with it. The wall. So in between procedures on the left, we've got welding procedures and PQRs on one side, and we've got welder qualification, which is personnel, on the other. We don't cross-pollinate these. We don't use one part of the code that works for procedures and then use it for personnel. Two totally different animals we're talking about. Two totally different, I don't know, universes, continents, whatever. Jars, buckets, they're totally different. So when we go into Article 2, that is procedures. Article 3 is personnel. And we need to realize there is a wall there. What happens on one side of the wall stays there. So we need to realize that. I've had millions of arguments with people telling me, oh, well, the procedure says this, and then they're quoting out of the personnel side. It doesn't work like that. You got to stay on your side of the wall, whether we're talking about personnel qualification or procedure qualification. So first up, we're going to talk about Article 2, which is Welding Procedure Qualifications. And we'll get into this later on in a later episode, but this is just a cursory overview because I'm talking about QW, so we're talking about the 4 parts. Well, Article 2 just covers procedures. That's it. It doesn't talk about personnel. So if I'm qualifying a WPS or a PQR, I'm going to stay in Article 2. I'm not going to stray out of there and go into Article 3 because Article 3 has nothing to do with procedures. If I am qualifying a welding procedure, I am going to stay in Article 2. That's the boundaries. I cannot leave that. It's two totally different sports. It's like American baseball and cricket, or rugby and cricket, however you want to talk about it. The rules of one does not apply to the other. Two totally different games. So we need to realize that. We need to realize their wall. We need to realize that Article 2 is just for procedures. We don't use Article 2 for qualification of welders. So here's an example of a PQR. A PQR is the written record of a design stage test weld that is then subjected to a number of destructive and non-destructive tests. The PQR is the record of the parameters used in performing the test weld as the record of the destructive and non-destructive tests. So a PQR is a document that lives in Section 2. Not lives in, but it comes from Section 2. So when we start qualifying procedure qualification records and writing WPSs, all of this happens in Article 2 of ASME Section 9 for welding. The PQR happens in Article 2. A WPS is an instruction sheet for welders. Basically, it is the recipe. How to make cookies, how to make bread, how to make lentils, how to make soup. It is the recipe that the welder, who is the cook in this instance, uses to make it. He follows these instructions to the letter of the law. The information on how to write a WPS is also contained in Article 2. So once again, PQRs, WPSs, we're staying in Article 2. I know I've said it about 6 times, but this is really important. That's why I keep repeating myself. Okay, now we're going to cross over the wall. We're going to jump over the wall into Article 3, which is welding performance qualifications. People, qualifying my welders to make the weld. We've left the other sport, the other country, whatever. We're not working in Article 2 anymore. We're in Article 3, which is welding performance qualification. It is on its own little island. So what happens over with procedures and procedure qualification records does not affect personnel, welder qualifications. So once again, don't confuse the two sides of the wall. Don't do it. There's 2 separate sides. When you're working with one, stay on that side of the wall. Okay, here's an example of a welder performance qualification record. So this is the essential variables and all the documentation that drives this is going to happen in Article 3. Like I said, it's probably going to take me a bunch of these episodes to get to where this is going, but I'll get into this deeper when we get to Article 3. Right now we're just in Article 1. But I want you to be cognizant of this because some of the things referenced in Article 1 have to do with welder qualification. So we need to be cognizant that this paperwork exists as we go forward, even though we're not dealing with it right now. And then the next part is kind of its own little zone. Article 4 is welding data. It's the storehouse. It's all the little bits and pieces of information about how to qualify welders, qualify procedures, qualify anything. But you don't go into this Article 4 unless another article or subsection of the code sends you there. Unless there's a very specific reason, you don't go wandering around in Article 4. Because if you read Article 4 top to bottom, front to back, there'll be parts in there where one quote out of the code will say one thing, and then the very next code or paragraph will contradict it, and the next paragraph will contradict both of those. So you don't ever go into Article 4 welding data unless something sends you in there, because you will just make a mess of things. Well, the code said this right here. Well, what sent you there is the argument I always have with people. Well, how'd you get here? You can't just be rummaging around in the welding data and cherry picking what you want. Something needs to send you into that zone, into Article 4, to get a very specific item. You can't just go in and start rummaging through the storage bins or the boxes of documents and say, oh, this fits. No, something or someone has to send you in there for a very specific reason. Once again, I know I'm long-winded, but this is just very important if you're really going to develop any kind of aptitude for dealing with ASME Section 9, writing procedures and qualifying welds. And inevitably, if you do that, you're going to end up arguing with people. So you got to understand how the code's built and when and how and why you go from one part to another or from one article to another. And, like I said, you don't mix Article 2 and Article 3. And you don't just go into Article 4 just because you thought you needed something out of there. Something out of the code has to send you there. Article 5, Standard Welding Procedure Specifications. This is known as an SWPSS. The SWPSs listed in Mandatory Appendix E are acceptable for construction in which the requirements of the ASME Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code Section 9 are specified. Any requirements of the applicable construction code section regarding SWPSs take precedence over the requirements of Section 9. These SWPSs are not permitted for construction where impact testing of the WPS is required by the construction code. This is out of Article 5. So an SWPS is basically where you go and purchase from the American Welding Society. They've got a whole list of these standard welding procedures. You pay them about $200. You go into Section 5 or Article 5. I always get section and article mixed up. Article 5 of ASME Section 9. You go into Article 5, and then when you're in there, it'll give you the rules and the things that your corporation or your entity, your company needs to do to be able to adopt this. And there's some rules, but basically you don't have to qualify a full-blown WPS PQR to start welding. You have to make a mock-up or something, but we'll get into that when we get to Article 5. The exacts of it, we'll grind through that. But basically this saves you from having to qualify a weld procedure for certain situations. But if you got to do impact testing, let's say you're doing some kind of cryogenic situation, liquid nitrogen or liquid natural gas, you can't use these. If the construction code requires impact testing, you can't use a standard welding procedure specification that you purchased. You'll have to qualify your own. Okay, now that we've kind of hashed through the preliminaries, let's talk about the scope of QW-100 in Article 1 of ASME Section 9. Okay, the rules of this part apply to the preparation of welding procedure specifications and the qualification of welding procedures, welders, and welding operators for all types of manual and machine welding processes permitted in this part. These rules may also be applied insofar as they are applicable to other manual or machine welding processes permitted in other sections. So basically this is saying we're dealing with welding. We're not dealing with brazing, we're not dealing with plastics, we're dealing with welding. And this includes welding procedures, PQRs, and qualification of people. So it lays out here what the scope is. QW-101. This tells us a WPS used by an organization that will have responsible operational control of production welding shall be a WPS that has been qualified by that organization in accordance with Article 2, or it shall be an AWS Standard Welding Procedure Specification, SWPS, listed in Mandatory Appendix E and adopted by that organization in accordance with Article 5. So this is telling us, hey, I can't go borrow my WPSs from somebody else's company. If I work for Fred's Barbecue and Welding of Tulsa, Oklahoma, I can't go and call up a friend of mine who works across the street and say, hey, Marvin, can I borrow one of your welding procedures? Can't do it. You can't swap them across like that unless you're all part of the greater organization. You're part of some giant corporation hell-bent on world domination or whatever. If you're all part of the same corporate tree or corporate entity and you follow the rules within ASME Section 9, you can swap. But if you're two distinct organizations, you can't share WPSs or PQRs. You could, if you had a friend, he could say, hey, this is how I would start, but you still need to go qualify your own WPS and PQRs to make this work. You can't borrow from another company. From Mandatory Appendix E, permitted SWPSs, this is their list. Remember on the previous slide, It said, or you can go get a permitted SWPSS, a standard welding procedure specification from the American Welding Society, pay them the $200, follow the rules. This would be an example of one of those. This is the first one off their permitted list, shielded metal arc welding. It's the standard welding procedure specification for shielded metal arc welding of carbon steel. M1, P1, S1, group 1 or 2, 1/8 inch through 1.5 inches thick, using 7018 in the as welded or post weld heat treated condition. Here's the number. You go pay the American Welding Society their $294 or whatever the pricing is now. I think it's under $300. They'll send you this document and you adopt it as your own. You go through the list of what you need to do, the list of requirements in Article 5, and you can run with it. You don't have to qualify the procedure in the standard fashion. You can buy this one, follow the requirements, and you're good to go. QW-103, responsibility. 103.1, welding. Each organization shall conduct the tests required in this section to qualify the welding procedures used in the construction of the weldments built under this code and the performance of welders and welding operators who apply these procedures. Records. Each organization shall maintain a record of the results obtained in welding procedure and welder and welding operator performance qualification. Refer to recommended forms in non-mandatory Appendix B. This is telling us you got to act like a grown-up. You got to act like an adult. You got to keep paperwork. You got to keep records. You got to keep documentation. You can't just be writing things on a napkin and throwing it in a box. You need to keep records of when you qualified people, the testing. Get yourself a file cabinet. Put everything in there when you're building your WPS or your PQRs. You put everything together, you make yourself a little documentation packet, so then if somebody audits you, you can break it out and say, okay, this is when we did the testing, this is when we tested our welders, this is what we've got going on. It's just telling you basically you got to keep documentations. So, and if you're the organization that's doing it, you can't have another group do your the tests required. Each organization shall conduct the tests. I can't have the company across the street conduct the tests and then I take credit for the WPS. So that's what it's telling us. It gets back to we have to do it. If it's our company, we have to do it. And then we have to keep records on it. For me, try not to get super long-winded here, but to me the key to this whole welding procedure and procedure specifications and this whole thing is documentation and keeping a tidy house when it comes to documentation. Keep records, keep track of what's going on, keep everything in file folders in a file cabinet so you can copy it, maybe turn it into a PDF and put it on a computer somewhere in addition to having a paper hard copy. Just some little extra advice there. QW-110, weld orientation. This is just a pretty short little snippet. The orientation of the welds are illustrated in figure QW-461.1 or figure QW-461.2. So remember I told you, don't go into Article 4 unless somebody sends you there, unless something sends you there. This is very specific. It sends us, QW-110 sends us to QW-461 or 461.2. So it tells us go there, we go there, we look at what we need to look at and get back. So here you can see the orientation of welds. It lays out how many degrees it is to what orientation. Okay, this is flat, this is horizontal, this is overhead, this is vertical. This is pretty important. Obviously they put it up front in the code. Weld orientation is very important for personnel qualification and talking about how the weld's orientated. So this is one of the bedrocks of the code right here, weld orientation. Very important. If you can't speak the language of weld orientation, you're probably going to have issues with the codes. QW-120. Okay, so we already got orientation. Now we're going to talk about test positions for groove welds. Groove welds may be made in test coupons orientated in any of the positions in figure QW 461.3 or figure QW-461.4, and as described in the following paragraphs, except that an angular deviation of plus or minus 15 degrees from the specified horizontal and vertical planes and an angular deviation of plus or minus 5 degrees from the specified inclined plane are permitted during welding. So it's going to tell you, we're going to talk about flat, 1G, 2G, which is horizontal. Well, you're allowed a couple of degrees of angular deviation, up to 15 degrees before it, let's say something, if you're welding vertical, you can move that 15 degrees either way before it becomes a different position. So that's what this is telling us. But test positions, very important. Like I said, they put it up front in the welding code here. This applies. Here's kind of the bedrock foundation of our language that we're going to be speaking, some of the terminology. And test positions is one of the cornerstones of this welding code as far as lingo you're going to need. Q121 plate positions. Like I said, this is pretty important stuff. If you can't talk this language about weld positions, you're going to sound like you don't know what you're doing. You could be a pretty sharp person, but if you can't speak the welding language and talk in the context of the codes and plate positions. So here you see we've got the flat position, which is 1G, 1 groove. Horizontal position is 2G. Vertical position, if we're welding either vertical up or vertical down, it's 3G. And then we've got the overhead position, which is 4G. This really comes into play with welder qualifications. When you start qualifying welders to actually make welds, the welding positions really come into play. They can also come into play in procedure qualifications, depending on what you've got going on. But the big thing is welder qualifications. So that was plate positions. Here we've got pipe positions. So you can see we've got 1G horizontal rolled. That would be if you're rolling the pipe. That's basically just flat welding. Then we've got 2G, which is horizontal, or 2G, yeah, that's a horizontal position, but the pipe's in vertical. But you're welding in a horizontal weld because it's the same welding position that you do with 2G plate. In the lower, lower left-hand corner, we've got 5G, which is horizontal fixed position. And then you've got, if the pipe's at a 45-degree angle, plus or minus 5 degrees, that's 6G. That's the most difficult pipe position to weld in. Okay, we've got QW-130 test positions for fillet welds. So for fillet welds, you can see we've got the 1F is the flat position, horizontal position is 2F, vertical position, if we're going either up or down, is a 3F, and then the overhead position is a 4F. So you need to be able to talk back and forth between G's and F's. F is for fillet, G is for grooves. So this is the basis of our, the positions when we start talking about weld test positions. Summary. Okay, part QW welding. This is going to have to be a two-part video because I'm at about 25 minutes right now, and I'm trying not to get super long-winded on these. I'll try and break them into smaller, more digestible chunks, so a guy doesn't have to watch the whole 3 hours of me rambling on about ASME Section 9. You can just take it in little pieces. So basically we covered welding positions, the breakout of how ASME Section 9 is for Article QW is broken out. It covers welding qualifications. We talked about groove welds. We talked about, the people that qualify the welds need to be responsible for them. You need to keep documentation on your welds and your procedures and your personnel. All that's laid out in Article 1. It's the basic foundation rule books and then a bunch of definitions. And we also discussed, the other articles of the code within QW, like Article 4. We don't go in there unless we have a very specific reason to go in there. You don't just go randomly digging around in Article 4 and pull out some piece of code that fits what you need unless something sent you there. But that's the summary of what we covered. Well, I broke it off here, stopped here, because if I went and talked about the rest of Article 1 right now, it would be super long. So, questions, comments, here's my contact information. I appreciate everybody that's a subscriber and listening to this. I hope that it helps you out in your professional lives. Shoot me an email if you got some questions. I'll try and help you. I can't promise that I can help everything, but shoot me an email if you have any questions. Thanks.